There is a moment that happens in almost every connection with an avoidant, but very few people notice it while it's happening. It's the moment when the chase stops. Not the dramatic kind where someone slams the door or sends a long emotional message, not the kind filled with accusations or tears. It's the quiet kind, the kind where you simply step back. You stop reaching out first. You stop asking why they're distant. You stop trying to fix what they never fully explained. And to the outside world, it may look like nothing has changed, but inside the avoidance mind, everything shifts. Because they were prepared for your frustration. They were prepared for your anger. They were even prepared for your final emotional outburst. What they were not prepared for was your calm. What they were not prepared for was your silence. And in that silence, something unexpected begins to grow inside them. It's not relief, it's not freedom, it's a strange, quiet curiosity. They start wondering what changed inside you. They start wondering why the energy they once felt from you is suddenly gone. And that's when a hidden hope begins to form in their heart, a hope they would never say out loud, a hope that maybe, just maybe, you would say something simple, something gentle, something that doesn't feel like pressure. Because deep down, avoidants don't run from love. They run from the feeling of being emotionally cornered. They run from expectations they feel they can't meet. They run from the fear that someone will see their distance as rejection instead of protection. So when you stop chasing, the first thing they secretly hope for is not confrontation. They don't want you to say, "Why did you do this to me?" They don't want you to say, "You ruined everything." What they secretly hope to hear is something far softer, something like, "I'm not mad at you." Those words carry a strange kind of relief for them. Because in their mind, they already assume you're angry, they assume you're hurt, and they assume they're the reason. Avoidants often carry quiet guilt, even if they don't show it. They know they pull away. They know they create distance. And even when they convince themselves it was necessary, there's a small voice inside them that wonders if they hurt someone who didn't deserve it. So when you stop chasing, they fear that your silence means resentment. They imagine you telling your friends how cold they were. They imagine you thinking they were heartless. But if instead they hear a calm voice saying, "I'm not mad at you," it does something unexpected. It lowers their defenses. It removes the invisible tension they were bracing themselves for. It makes them feel like they're not being judged. And that feeling is rare for them, because most of their life, emotional closeness came with pressure, expectations, or disappointment. So your calm understanding doesn't push them away. It draws them closer in a way they can actually handle. And then comes another quiet hope they carry, one they may never admit. They hope you'll say, "You don't have to explain everything." Because one of the heaviest burdens avoidants carry is the feeling that they can't properly explain their own emotions. They know they pull away, but they often don't fully understand why. They know they feel overwhelmed, but they struggle to put it into words. And when someone asks them to explain themselves, it doesn't feel like a simple conversation. It feels like pressure. It feels like standing under a spotlight without a script. So when you stop chasing, they secretly fear the moment you'll demand answers. They imagine you asking, "Why did you ignore me? Why did you disappear? Why couldn't you just talk to me?" And those questions, even when they're reasonable, feel like emotional traps to them. Because they don't have the answers you want, and they're afraid of disappointing you with their silence. But if instead you say something like, "You don't have to explain everything," it removes a huge weight from their chest. It tells them they're not being forced into emotional performance. It tells them they're not required to justify every feeling they have. And strangely, that freedom makes them more likely to open up on their own. Because avoidants don't respond well to pressure, but they do respond to safety. When they feel safe, they start processing their emotions in their own time. And when that happens, they sometimes come back with words they never thought they'd say. But the next thing they secretly hope to hear is even simpler. It's a sentence that feels almost too small to matter, yet it carries enormous meaning to them. "I respect your space." To most people, space just means distance. But to an avoidant, space means survival. It means emotional breathing room. It means not feeling trapped by someone else's expectations. When you chase them, even with love, they often feel overwhelmed. Not because you did something wrong, but because closeness activates fears they don't fully understand. They start worrying about losing themselves. They start worrying about disappointing you. They start worrying about being responsible for your emotions. And that pressure builds quietly inside them until the only way they know how to handle it is to pull away. So when you stop chasing, they don't secretly hope you'll say, "You abandoned me." They don't hope you'll say, "You need to fix this." What they secretly hope to hear is, "I respect your space." Because that sentence tells them something very important. It tells them they are not being controlled. It tells them they are not being forced into closeness before they're ready. And that sense of freedom changes everything. When avoidants feel pressured, they run. But when they feel respected, they become curious. They start wondering why you're different. They start noticing the calm energy you bring. And instead of associating you with emotional weight, they start associating you with emotional safety. Then comes another realization that quietly shifts their perspective. When you stop chasing and you say something like, "I'm focusing on my own life now," it creates a powerful emotional signal. Not because it threatens them, but because it shows strength. Avoidants often feel suffocated when someone's happiness depends entirely on them. It creates a sense of responsibility they don't know how to carry. They worry that if they pull away, the other person will fall apart, and that fear makes closeness feel dangerous. But when you calmly say, "I'm focusing on my own life now," it removes that burden. It tells them your world doesn't revolve around them. It tells them you're not waiting in emotional suspension. And instead of feeling relieved in the way they expected, they start feeling something else. They start feeling curious. They start wondering what you're doing. They start noticing your absence in small, unexpected ways. The message they once received every morning isn't there anymore. The emotional support they once leaned on quietly has disappeared. And slowly, almost without realizing it, they begin to miss what felt so natural before, because avoidants often don't recognize the value of emotional presence until it's gone, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. They're used to distance, they're used to self-reliance. So the gentle, steady support you gave them didn't always feel extraordinary. It just felt normal until it wasn't there anymore. And that's when another hidden hope surfaces in their heart. They hope that if you ever speak again, you'll say something like, "You never owed me perfection." Because one of the deepest fears avoidants carry is the fear of disappointing someone who loves them. They may act detached, but underneath that detachment is a quiet insecurity. They worry they're not emotionally expressive enough. They worry they can't meet expectations. They worry they'll eventually hurt the person who cares about them. So instead of risking that disappointment, they pull away first. It feels safer to create distance than to stay close and fail. But if they hear you say, "You never owed me perfection," it touches something very vulnerable inside them. It tells them they weren't expected to be someone else. It tells them they weren't required to perform love in a certain way. And that kind of acceptance feels incredibly rare to them, because many avoidants grew up in environments where love felt conditional, where closeness came with pressure, criticism, or emotional demands. So when you offer acceptance without expectations, it doesn't feel normal, it feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things, when they're gentle, tend to stay in their mind. They start replaying your words, they start comparing your calm understanding to other relationships they've had. And slowly, they begin to see you differently. Not as someone who chased them, not as someone who pressured them, but as someone who understood them in a way few people ever did. And that realization doesn't always happen immediately. Sometimes it takes days, sometimes weeks, sometimes longer, but the moment you stop chasing and the moment you respond with calm, understanding words instead of emotional pressure, something shifts inside them. Because what avoidants secretly hope to hear isn't control, anger, or demands, it's peace, it's understanding. It's the feeling that love doesn't have to feel like a trap. And when they sense that from you, even in your absence, they start to see your presence in a completely different light. And as that shift settles in, something even more uncomfortable begins to surface inside them. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, it doesn't announce itself with panic. It's subtle. It's the slow realization that the gentle love they once had access to is no longer reaching for them. Avoidants often don't react strongly in the moment you stop chasing. On the outside, they may seem unchanged, but internally they begin to notice the quiet spaces where you used to exist, the message that checked on them, the reassurance they didn't ask for but quietly relied on, the emotional warmth that stayed steady even when they pulled back. When that disappears, they don't always label it as loss. Right away, at first, it feels like relief. Relief from pressure, relief from expectations, relief from the feeling that someone is waiting for them to respond. But relief doesn't last forever, because once the nervous system calms down, the silence starts echoing. And in that echo, they begin to recognize something rare they may have taken for granted. They begin to miss the way you cared without demanding. They begin to miss the way you showed up without forcing. They may not say it, but inside, they start hoping you'll say something like, I care about you, but I care about myself too. That sentence carries power. It doesn't beg, it doesn't accuse, it doesn't collapse. It shows strength and softness at the same time. And that balance is deeply attractive to an avoidant. Because one of their biggest fears is being consumed by someone else's emotional needs. When they feel like someone depends entirely on them for happiness, it creates anxiety. It creates pressure. It triggers their instinct to escape. But when you show that you can love them while still standing firmly on your own, it shifts their perception of you. You're no longer someone chasing, you're someone choosing. And being chosen feels very different than being chased. Chasing feels like obligation. Choosing feels like freedom. As time passes, another quiet realization starts forming in their mind. They notice something they didn't expect. Without the emotional chase, their internal tension decreases. When you were pursuing, texting, asking for clarity, trying to reconnect, their nervous system often felt activated. Even if your intentions were pure, their body interpreted it as pressure. Now, with the pursuit gone, they feel calmer. But here's the part they don't talk about. That calm doesn't automatically make them forget you. In fact, it creates space for something else to grow. Curiosity. Because now, instead of reacting to your energy, they have room to think about you. They replay conversations. They remember moments where you were patient. They reflect on how you handled things differently than others. And in that reflection, another hidden hope emerges. They secretly wish that if they ever reach out again, you'll say, you can come back when you're ready. That sentence feels like an open door without a trap attached to it. It doesn't demand immediate change. It doesn't require instant vulnerability. It simply communicates availability without urgency. And urgency is what overwhelms avoidance the most. They process emotions slowly. They often don't understand their own feelings until long after an event has passed. So when someone expects immediate clarity, they shut down. But when someone offers time, they soften. Time feels safe. Time feels manageable. And when you communicate that you're not slamming the door, but you're also not waiting helplessly outside it, it creates a powerful emotional contrast. You become steady instead of desperate. You become grounded instead of reactive. And that grounded energy lingers in their mind. As days or weeks pass, they begin noticing something else. They start missing you in small, unexpected moments, not in dramatic late-night breakdowns, not in overwhelming waves of regret, but in quiet, ordinary experiences. When something funny happens and they instinctively think of telling you, when they accomplish something and realize you're not there to quietly celebrate it, when they feel stressed and remember how you once calmed them without making it about yourself. These small absences slowly accumulate, and that's when the next secret hope forms. They hope that if they reach out, you won't say, it's too late, because one of their deepest fears is finality. Even though they create distance, they rarely intend permanent loss. Their pulling away is usually about self-protection, not rejection. But when they start realizing that you may truly be moving forward, a subtle anxiety appears. Not because they want to control you, but because they're confronting the possibility of losing something safe. And that safety wasn't always obvious to them while you were chasing. It becomes obvious when it's gone. In that space, they may start testing the waters. A small message, a casual reaction, something light. And in that moment, what they secretly hope to hear is not bitterness. They don't want sarcasm. They don't want punishment disguised as indifference. They hope for something calm, something like, hey, it's good to hear from you. That simple response lowers their defenses again. It tells them they're not walking into hostility. It tells them connection is still possible without emotional debt. Because emotional debt is what scares them, the feeling that they owe you something they don't know how to give. But if your response carries steadiness, it reassures them that this isn't a trap. And as they continue reflecting, another realization becomes harder to ignore. They start noticing that you seem happier or at least more at peace. You're not posting sad messages. You're not sending indirect signals. You're not trying to prove anything. You're simply living. And that quiet confidence unsettles them in a way they didn't expect, because when you were chasing, they felt like they had control over the dynamic. Now, they're not so sure. You've shifted the energy. And in that shift, they start hoping you'll say something like, I'm not here to control you. Control is one of their core fears. Even perceived control can trigger their instinct to withdraw. They need to feel autonomous. They need to feel like they're choosing connection, not being pushed into it. So when you demonstrate that you're not trying to manage their emotions, not trying to direct their behavior, not trying to force intimacy, it changes how they view you. You no longer represent pressure. You represent possibility, and possibility feels safe enough to explore. The more they observe your emotional stability, the more they begin questioning their own reactions. They may start asking themselves why they felt overwhelmed before. They may begin recognizing patterns in their own behavior. This doesn't always lead to immediate transformation, but it plants a seed, and seeds grow quietly. Over time, that seed can turn into self-awareness, and self-awareness can turn into longing. Not longing for chaos, not longing for intensity, but longing for the kind of calm presence you offered without demanding ownership. And in the quiet of their own thoughts, they may finally admit something they never said out loud. They didn't want you to chase them forever. They wanted to feel chosen without feeling trapped. They wanted to feel cared for without feeling responsible for someone else's entire emotional world. They wanted connection without suffocation. And when you stop chasing, when you stand in your own peace, when your words carry softness instead of pressure, you give them a glimpse of what that kind of connection could actually look like. That's why the phrases they secretly hope to hear are never dramatic. They're simple, gentle, steady, because beneath their distance is someone who fears emotional overwhelm more than emotional closeness. And when you remove the overwhelm, what remains is space. Space for reflection, space for curiosity, space for missing you in ways they never expected. And in that space, something begins to change. And in that space where the pressure has faded and the noise of the chase is gone, something unfamiliar begins to happen inside them. It's not dramatic, it doesn't come with a sudden realization or a moment of cinematic regret. It's slower than that, more subtle. It's the quiet recognition that you didn't slam the door, you didn't turn cold, you didn't try to control the outcome. Instead, you left something open behind you. And deep down, they begin hoping that if the connection ever comes up again, you'll say something simple, something like, "You can come back when you're ready." That sentence carries a strange kind of comfort for an avoidant. It doesn't feel like a demand. It doesn't feel like a deadline. It feels like an open doorway with no one standing there forcing them through it. And that's important because avoidants don't respond well to urgency. Urgency feels like pressure, and pressure feels like danger. So when someone says, "You can come back when you're ready," it removes the emotional clock they fear so much. It gives them room to breathe. And ironically, that breathing room is what often allows their feelings to surface in the first place. Because when they're not overwhelmed, they start thinking more clearly. They start remembering the small moments they once overlooked, the way you listened without interrupting, the way you showed up, even when they were distant, the way your presence felt calm instead of chaotic. And slowly, those memories start forming a quiet ache, not a dramatic heartbreak, just a gentle awareness that something meaningful existed there. And that awareness often shows up in the most ordinary moments. They may be sitting alone after a long day, scrolling through their phone and realize there's no message from you anymore. They may hear a song that reminds them of a conversation you once had. They may pass a place where the two of you shared a quiet moment, and for a second they feel that absence more deeply than they expected. That's when the missing starts to feel real, not because you forced it, not because you demanded attention, but because your presence used to be part of their emotional landscape. And now, that landscape feels a little emptier. And as that emptiness becomes more noticeable, another quiet hope forms in their heart. They hope that if they ever cross your path again, you'll say something like, "I'm not here to control you," because control has always been one of their deepest fears. Even when someone means well, even when the intentions are loving, the feeling of being managed or emotionally directed can make them shut down. It reminds them of moments in their past where closeness came with pressure, where love felt conditional, where they had to be a certain way to be accepted. So when you show them that you're not trying to control their choices, not trying to force their emotions, it feels different. It feels safe. It feels like connection without a cage attached to it. And that kind of connection is something they secretly crave, even if they've never admitted it. Because avoidants aren't heartless, they're just protective. They've learned often very early in life that too much closeness can come with pain. So they built distance as a shield. But shields don't just block pain, they also block warmth. And when someone comes along who offers warmth without pressure, it confuses them. It challenges their old beliefs about relationships. As they observe you from a distance, they start noticing something else. You're not chasing anymore, but you're also not falling apart. You're not posting sad messages. You're not trying to make them jealous. You're simply living your life. Maybe you're focusing on your goals. Maybe you're spending more time with people who support you. Maybe you're just enjoying your own company in ways you didn't before, and that quiet happiness creates a strange reaction inside them. It's not jealousy in the traditional sense, it's more like admiration mixed with a subtle fear of being left behind. Because when they see you at peace without them, it challenges the idea that they were the center of your world. And instead of feeling relieved, they start feeling something else. They start wondering what it would be like to be part of that peaceful version of your life. And that's when another hidden hope surfaces. They hope you'll say something like, I wish you well, no matter what. Those words carry an unexpected emotional impact. Because avoidants often expect bitterness when a connection fades. They expect resentment. They expect emotional walls. But when you offer them genuine well wishes, it removes the tension they were bracing for. It tells them that your care wasn't conditional on their behavior. It tells them that your feelings weren't just a reaction to what they gave you. And that kind of unconditional kindness stays with them. It echoes in their mind. They start comparing it to other experiences, other relationships where love felt like a transaction, where affection came with strings attached. And slowly they begin to realize how rare your energy was, how rare it is to find someone who cares without trying to control the outcome. This realization doesn't always lead to immediate action. Avoidants don't usually move quickly when it comes to emotions. They process things slowly, often in private, often without telling anyone. But the more they think about you, the more they replay your calm responses, the more another truth starts forming inside them. They begin to see your emotional maturity, and that maturity surprises them because they expected drama, they expected anger, they expected some kind of emotional explosion when you stopped chasing. But instead, you responded with calm strength, and that breaks their expectations. It makes them question their assumptions about relationships. It makes them wonder if closeness doesn't always have to feel overwhelming. And in that moment of reflection, they start hoping you'll say something like, take the time you need. That sentence feels like permission. Permission to move at their own pace. Permission to process their emotions without being rushed. And for someone who has spent most of their life feeling emotionally pressured, that permission feels incredibly comforting. It tells them that connection doesn't have to come with a countdown. It tells them they're not being forced into vulnerability before they're ready. And when someone feels that kind of patience, something softens inside them. Their defenses lower just a little, their fear of closeness becomes less intense. And sometimes in that softened state, they start to consider possibilities they once avoided. They start to imagine what it would feel like to reconnect without pressure. They start to wonder if maybe this time could be different. Not because you chased them, not because you convinced them, but because you showed them a different kind of love. One that feels calm instead of chaotic. One that feels steady instead of demanding. And that kind of love doesn't just disappear from their memory, it lingers. It grows quietly in the background of their thoughts. It becomes a reference point for what connection can feel like when it's built on respect instead of pressure. And as those thoughts continue to settle, they begin to understand something they couldn't see before. That your decision to stop chasing wasn't rejection, it was self-respect. And that self-respect didn't push them away. It gave them the space to finally see you clearly. And when they finally begin to see you clearly, the realization doesn't arrive with noise or drama. It comes quietly, almost like a soft truth that settles into their chest when they're not paying attention. They start recognizing something they never expected to feel: respect. Not the kind that comes from admiration at a distance, but the kind that grows when someone shows emotional strength without needing to prove it. Because when you stopped chasing, you didn't become cold, you didn't try to punish them, you didn't turn your silence into a weapon. You simply became steady, and that steadiness feels different to them. It feels unfamiliar. Most avoidants are used to emotional extremes. Either someone clings tightly or someone disappears completely. Either someone demands constant reassurance or someone shuts down without explanation. But you did something different. You stepped back without bitterness. You created distance without hostility. And that kind of emotional maturity shocks them in a quiet way. They expected you to react. They expected you to fight for their attention. They expected at least one dramatic moment where emotions spilled over. But when that moment never came, they were left with something much harder to ignore. You're calm. And calm energy is powerful. It doesn't chase, it doesn't beg, it simply exists. And in the presence of that calm, they start to feel something unfamiliar stirring inside them, a sense of introspection. They begin asking themselves questions they once avoided. Why did they feel overwhelmed? Why did closeness feel so threatening? Why did someone who treated them with patience and understanding still trigger their instinct to pull away? These questions don't always come with easy answers, but the fact that they're asking them at all is a sign of change, because avoidants often avoid not just people, but their own emotions. They push feelings aside, they distract themselves, they convince themselves that distance is always safer. But when someone like you enters their life, someone who offered warmth without pressure, it creates a contrast they can't ignore forever. And that contrast leads to another quiet hope forming in their heart. They hope that if your paths ever cross again, you'll say something like, "I'm not going anywhere, but I'm not chasing either." That sentence carries a balance they secretly crave. It offers stability without suffocation. It shows presence without pressure. It tells them that you're not disappearing, but you're also not sacrificing yourself to keep the connection alive. And that kind of boundary feels safe to them, because boundaries don't feel like control, they feel like structure. And structure creates a sense of emotional security they didn't even realize they needed. As they reflect on everything, another moment arrives. It's subtle, but it carries weight. They start replaying your words in their mind, the calm responses, the gentle phrases, the moments where you chose understanding over confrontation. These memories begin to echo in quiet spaces, maybe late at night, maybe during a long drive, maybe in the middle of an ordinary day when something reminds them of you. And those echoes feel different than the memories of other connections. There's no chaos attached to them, no emotional storms, just a quiet sense of warmth. And that warmth becomes something they compare to other people they meet. They notice how rare it is to find someone who doesn't try to control them, someone who doesn't pressure them into emotional performances, someone who simply cared without turning that care into a burden. And the more they compare, the more they realize how different you were. That realization doesn't always lead to immediate action. Avoidance often moves slowly when it comes to emotional decisions. But inside, something changes. The idea of you stops being associated with pressure. Instead, it becomes associated with peace. And peace is something they rarely experience in close relationships. Because most of their life, closeness came with expectations, with emotional weight, with the fear of disappointing someone. But with you, even when things were difficult, there was a sense of calm underneath it all. And now that calm feels like something they lost, not because you left in anger, but because you stepped back with self-respect. And that difference matters. Because anger can be dismissed, anger can be rationalized, but calm strength is harder to ignore. It stays in their mind. It becomes a quiet standard they compare other connections to. And slowly the truth they rarely admit begins to surface. What they wanted all along wasn't distance, it wasn't isolation, it wasn't emotional walls. What they wanted was love that didn't feel overwhelming. Love that didn't feel like a demand, love that didn't make them feel like they were losing themselves. They wanted connection that felt safe, steady, pressure-free. And when they think back to you, they start realizing that you offered something very close to that. Not perfectly, not without challenges, but closer than most people ever did. And that realization can be both comforting and painful at the same time. Comforting because it reminds them that safe connection is possible. Painful because they know they may have pushed it away. But even in that pain, there's still hope, because the phrases they secretly hoped to hear were never complicated. They were never dramatic. They were always simple, gentle, steady words. Words that didn't chase them. Words that didn't corner them. Words that simply offered understanding. And when someone hears those kinds of words, especially someone who has spent their life guarding their heart, it leaves a mark. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, but a quiet, lasting one. The kind that stays with them long after the chase is over. The kind that makes them wonder, in the quiet moments, what it would feel like to walk back towards someone who never tried to trap them, only to understand them. And sometimes that wondering is the first step towards something they never thought they were ready for.